Go.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Pop Music Books in Process series, a joint effort of the Journal for Popular Music Studies and the Pop Conference. I think those are the only sponsors. Today we have a conversation between Christine Capetola and DiPiero. We'll introduce today's speakers. DiPiero is a musician, visiting assistant professor of musicology at Ithaca College, and incoming assistant professor of music studies at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. His first book, Contingent Encounters, Improvisation in Music and Everyday Life, was published with the University of Michigan Press in 2022. His second book, tentatively titled Big Feelings, Feminist Affect and Indie Rock After Riot Grrrl, is also under contract with Michigan and will appear as part of their Tracking Pop series. Other work has appeared or is forthcoming in critical studies in improvisation, jazz and culture, Journal of Popular Music Studies, and more. Christine Capetola is assistant professor of African American Studies at California State University, Fullerton. She works at the intersections of queer, Black sound, affect, and performance studies. Their book project, Sonic Feminists, Black Culture Makers, Felt History, and Vibrational Identity, theorizes that feminist is a sonic, felt, and vibrational configuration that can help us make aesthetic and historical connections between the recent past and present moment. She's published articles and chapters in Black, queer, and sound studies journals and volumes, along with essays and music criticism on pop music. They publish essays about contemporary pop and R&B and emotionality at www.christinecapetola.com. And now we'll turn it over to the two of you.
Cool. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm excited to talk to all of you. And before we start our conversation, I'm gonna go old-fashioned and read something off of paper. Also because there's a lot of like fun images at the beginning of the book that I thought would be, enjoyable to share. So I'm gonna throw this up here and hope that it works okay. Yeah, good, cool. So, right, thanks again. And before I start, I just want to make sure to plug the Fund to Mission program at University of Michigan Press, which is how this book and a lot of other books were made available open access. So I can throw a link in the chat later, but you can just download it. PDF is all there for free, or if you're inclined to grab a physical copy. I'm told this code will work even though it's from the fall for 30% off. Yeah, and what I thought I'd do before we talk about it more is just sort of introduce the main context and a couple opening anecdotes that get at the stakes a little bit. Obviously, as the subtitle implies, the main idea of the book is to compare the idea of improvisation between musical and social contexts in order to get a better understanding of its aesthetic and political implications. And initially, as I was writing, this was my effort to give some serious attention to a relationship that I felt was often noted in passing. So you can see here on this first slide, like truly just a few examples of some of the most common ways that I think everyday life and improvisation are frequently brought into conversation, which is this kind of casual equivalence that gets drawn in service of some larger point. So these quotes, I think, all represent accurate views. But in order to make their points, each of these relies on a kind of common sense agreement within the community regarding the fact that improvisation and everyday life do share some kind of relationship, maybe even a strong relationship. So up here, when Tracy McMullen, for example, claims that musical improvisation is much like daily life, that is tacitly accepted in service of her larger point in the article, which doesn't have to do with everyday life at all, but is about John Cage. So what I wanted to do was sort of question the foundation of the assumption that allows that kind of thinking to take place. What exactly is the quality of the relationship between musical improvisation and everyday life? rather than taking for granted certain perceived truisms about that relationship, what would it look like to return to the root of our assumptions and think about that in earnest? So to do this, I structured the book in 2 parts, which each follow improvisation across a series of case studies. In the first half, I explore how improvisation appears across 3 musical examples, which I think we'll get into later. Where in the second half, I look for improvisation in everyday life. And my hope was that this kind of cross-disciplinary comparison would help clarify the differences and similarities across 2 academic modes, discourses, and also realms of human experience. So as I said, what I'd like to do here is to try to introduce a few examples just to sort of ground the stakes of the argument. And those have to do with improvisation's sort of normative appearance in popular discourse. And I thought this would be a kind of fun way to get into, the context in which the argument is taking place. So for instance, to get us started here, in 2018, Nike announced a new branding project and philosophy called ISPA, Improvise, Scavenge, Protect, Adapt. On this image, we can see the first page of what is intended, I assume, to look like a kind of company memo. And in part, the copy reads, quote, "Within the built environment, we live in a constant state of evolution. The updates to it, particularly in movement in and around it, force a constant reappraisal of what it means to be human. ISPA is a response to and solution for the shifting variants of this change. It is a declaration of communication with and awareness of the perpetual challenges." So beyond the poor writing, what's notable here to me is Nike's invocation of improvisation as a constant adaptation to circumstance. The copy continues, quote, "ISPA is a belief that with a little inspiration, any problem can be solved with the materials at hand." When I say this is notable, what I mean is that this characterization, even though it's sort of couched in this ubiquitous and nonsensical kind of business speak, is fundamentally not so different from how improvisation is often described by scholars and artists themselves. So I have a few more examples of this here. Kristen Klochkol's 2020 book on urban planning, quote, "makes improvisation useful and applicable to the condition of today's technology-imbued cities and proposes a new future for responsive urban design." Columbia College philosopher Stephen Asma thinks that generally speaking, we could all do with learning how to improvise a little better. Food blogs counsel 6 ways to become a fearless improviser in the kitchen, while NPR views improvisation as a means to becoming funnier and more confident. Alarmingly, medical improv is an emerging term for the adaptation of improvisational theater principles and training techniques to improve communication, cognition, and teamwork in the field of medicine. That was a quote. Relatedly, business consulting firms advise readers on how to improvise your way through COVID-19. More infamously, improvisation is frequently invoked to describe the behavior of the 45th president. And different still, improvise, adapt, overcome is something of an unofficial motto for the United States Marine Corps. Finally, in the UK, Tide's Business Current account is a startup-focused banking service that promises clients one less thing to improvise. So I start with these examples because while the invocations of improvisation here might seem uninspired or even problematic, what I'm trying to suggest in the book is that it is incumbent on scholars to seriously consider the idea that such neoliberal uses of the term are not somehow less ideal, authentic, or accurate deployments, but rather that they reflect the very flexibility in which many scholars paradoxically locate hopeful resistance to neoliberalism. In other words, if improvisation scholars are right about the terms adaptability, its capacity to appear anywhere and everywhere, then its imbrication within neoliberal capital should not come as a surprise, but rather should be studied alongside instances that we might find inspiring, especially those that bear some kind of progressive social implications. I wanted to point out in the book the way that much improvisation scholarship actually duplicates this kind of extractive logic in the corporate model. Though aiming for different ends, scholars who claim that improvisation can transform the way we do business mimic these corporate models while simultaneously and perhaps unintentionally shielding themselves from critique by aiming their efforts at progressive ends. So in the book, I talk about a progressive theory of improvisation at work in many of improvisation studies' most prominent scholarly examples. And this is arguably most visibly articulated through the Improvisation Community and Social Practice series published by Duke University Press. At the farthest end of this formula is what I call the utopian strain of theorizing improvisation, which posits improvisation as a necessarily subversive and liberatory practice. So, for example, in The Fierce Urgency of Now, published in 2013, although the authors take care to disclaim that, quote, "we do not adhere to the formalism that would dictate that any form of improvisation is automatically democratic, egalitarian, and emancipatory," Fischlin, Hebley, and Lipsitz also make the bold claim that, quote, "as a marker of the co-generative power of the public commons, improvisation is inherently anti-neoliberal." Recently, Vijay Iyer has advanced an important critique of this kind of progressive theorizing and its focus on improvisation's capacity to foster community, reimagine social space, or undermine neoliberalism. While he urges music theorists to take improvisation's historically dismissed status seriously, he also argues that, quote, "the resurgent academic interest in improvisation does not offer a way out, at least not as it is currently studied." For Iyer, the turn to improvisation in academia, without often enough even citing Black scholars, bears all the hallmarks of a, quote, "rehabilitative gesture, a vindication, a hollow performative rescue of what society has deemed abject, and which usually confers disproportionate value on the institutions and individuals who aim to do the rehabilitating." I want to specify, while I agree with this line of thinking, I also think there are lots of other good reasons to be suspicious of this kind of progressive theorizing, including arguments made by several scholars asking us to pay more attention to the gaps or exclusions that go unthought when we focus on entanglement and being in common as end goals in and of themselves. Relatedly, I've also suggested that improvisation scholars' refusal to define what they mean by the word improvisation is, while motivated by a concern for difference, a problem that inadvertently ends up reproducing a very specific perspective that remains unmarked. That is, improvisation is consistently understood as open and flexible, where it's actually both consistent and particular. On this view, part of improvisation studies' general refusal to define the word, while in some ways testifying to its multifaceted deployment, might also be understood as the very means by which convenient assumptions about its ostensibly special qualities are imported without commentary. More often than not, unspoken implications characterize improvisation as a creative and open-minded process, one that is subject-focused and valorized insofar as it represents a departure from the normal way of doing things. In my view, these assumptions can be particularly problematic inasmuch as they first mirror and therefore reinforce the kinds of neoliberal uses discussed above, and second, as they mask the exceptions that Iyer raises, diverting attention away from cases in which such liberatory experiences don't apply evenly or ideally onto social life, and in which the consequences of improvisatory scenes vary wildly for marginalized groups and individuals. So before I wrap up this part here, I think it's worth mentioning just a few more examples of where this kind of thinking can run into trouble. So for me, I think about improvisation in the context of Uber drivers, food deliverers, and university professors. Improvised music is often lauded for its ability to facilitate a pursuit of the unknown, but across these working conditions under neoliberalism, it is precisely the unknown that is the problem. Contingency functions here in very specific ways. By overloading contingency onto one group of workers, administrators are freed up to do a different type of improvising, to move their budgets around, shuffle numbers, and run their corporations with as little resistance as possible. On the other hand, improvisation is forced on the workers whose real lives lie at the other end of that number crunching. In this way, contingent faculty share much with the gig economy workers whose essential services have been so critical during the pandemic, but not critical enough to warrant a raise in wages to the threshold of livability. As with Uber drivers, part-time grocery store workers, and delivery service contractors, very specific types of contingencies are forced on these workers, while agentic improvisation, the powers of flexibility, adaptability, and choice, that's reserved for the capitalist class. Clearly, both of these groups improvise, making use of their constraints to maneuver or invent or live. But if you look at the specificity of those constraints, one immediately sees how incommensurate experiences of improvisation can be. So my book asks us to pay attention to the mundane, the unremarkable, or the even dangerous instantiations of improvisation, arguing that a one-sided emphasis on its ostensibly progressive qualities will lead to studies that don't hold up under scrutiny. I have a final, very bleak example of this here, in which improvisation gets deployed unsuccessfully, in this case, to defend the actions of a murderer. At Derek Chauvin's trial, his lawyer, Eric Nelson, presented the following line of question to a Minneapolis police lieutenant. Nelson says, "You would agree, however, that in a fight for your life, generally speaking, in a fight for your life, you as an officer are allowed to use whatever force is reasonable and necessary, correct?" Zimmerman, yes. Nelson, and that can even involve improvisation. Agreed? Here we see improvisation functioning very clearly as an attempted justification for brutality, the idea being that actions made in real time should not carry the same consequences as those that were decided in advance. Building theories of social resistance on a concept capable of being invoked in this way remains, in my view, troublesome. So finally, to conclude, are there ways of thinking with and through improvisation that would not only avoid some of these pitfalls, but that also might point towards more ethically and politically responsible scholarship? I suggest that one approach might be to forcibly suspend our longstanding assumptions about what improvisation does by turning instead to a different term, which is contingency. Whether in the music of Eric Dolphy or in the process of baking bread, the task I tried to give myself throughout the book was to elaborate how improvisation becomes coextensive with contingency, which is another way of saying that it's not a special activity at all, but the thing that happens anytime we're in a contingent situation. And since we're always in contingent situations, we're always improvising. In a certain sense, this book then aims to dissolve the concept of improvisation into nothingness, or to paraphrase Iyer, paraphrasing Wadada Leo Smith, to take the term out back and beat it to death. I actually try to resist reading this as a nihilistic exercise, but rather an invitation to attend to our own improvising in different ways. And that is where I will stop it with a picture of Eric Dolphy's beautiful album. And I'm excited to talk about any aspect of all of that.
Okay, thanks, Dan, for setting us up in that way. I think it really gets to the heart of the introduction, and just wanted to say it's been a joy to listen to or read different versions of this work since 2017 now. So I'm really excited to talk about it with you. I'm going to ask some questions. They're in the style of the questions I often ask as an audience member in these, and they're long and extra long because we can do that because it's our session. So I'll just jump right into the first one, which is more of the big picture question, and then we can just kind of get more granular from there. But the setup first, one critique of contemporary music journalism is that the writing about artists is too celebratory, basically PR for them, and therefore not attuned enough to nuance. And then there's also a similar critique that I've heard within Black studies in the past few years, that writing about Black culture within an emancipatory framing, such as how many people write about Beyonce, for example, misses how ingrained in capitalism both musical production and performance are, and never mind takes away from a focus on the real political work of a Marxist critique of structures of oppression and racism and other kinds of isms. So what I really appreciate about your book is that without being emancipatory, since you explicitly say in the introduction that this is not how you're going to define improvisation or contingency, you instead bring us into this framework as of the musical performance as everyday event where subjects, objects, and environments are affected by and responding to different political contexts, even if that's not consciously in the room. So chapter 2, Eric Dolphy, 2 assumptions about Black gender and queerness. Chapter 3, Mr. K, to the politics of so-called Norwegian jazz, both the aesthetics of it and how to teach it. And then chapter 4, Ingrid Laubrock and Kris Davis's how to train the next generations of musicians, and then how that informs the care that they musically share with one another. So what does improvisation and contingency tell us about the porousness between the political and the cultural? And I asked that partially because I was really fascinated by how, reading it again this time, how Black Lives Matter continually pops up in the book as this example of a rare moment when a lot of people's everyday improvisations actually were in sync, and it did not last at the intensity that it did in summer 2020, but that the real crux of the book is these smaller musical and everyday improvisations, how they're ongoing and they depend less on such highly visible events, which is where I think you engage so beautifully with Sarah Ahmed's work. So yeah, what is improvisation and contingency tell us about this relationship between the political and the cultural?
Yeah, that's I feel like there's so many different directions to go there. I guess I'll try to address it in 2 parts. The porousness between the social and the political, or the musical and the social, right? In some ways, that's like my whole concern in the book, is to bring, particularly, I guess I have a little bit of an axe to grind with improvisation studies that focus on the music that's happening, right? And it's very common to talk about the interactivity and the interdependence of the musicians and how they feed off one another and how collaborative it is and so forth, without actually attending to like these larger extra musical social structures that are also playing a role, including social questions, including political questions. Musical improvisation, even when it's great and creatively generative, your identity is factoring into that experience in a way that, the saxophone and the chord changes also are. It's all happening there. It's just that one gets a lot more attention in scholarship than another, in my opinion. So, yeah, like what I try to do with Dolphy, if Dolphy's helpful to ground the conversation, is to talk about his identity as much as I talk about the way he plays chord changes, which has gotten disproportionate emphasis in the literature. Dolphy's race, his gender presentation, his economic conditions, they deeply affected his musical output, and also the way his musical output was interpreted by the press. So I don't understand how we can possibly attend to his music without also attending to those things. That's one level on which the political and the social are like, right there with the musical, constituting it, not just adding a layer, but actually making it possible, making it audible as such. I guess the other way that I think about your question in terms of, how Black Lives Matter appears in the book is through Ahmed, this beautiful quote that she has, which is like, she says, a social experience might be how we're thrown by contingency. And so I think about like, what's political about improvising? Nothing really. But if we're, in the end of the book, I talk about musical improvisation as an active attending to the improvisations that we're always already participating in. And if we're doing that, if we're paying attention, if we're cultivating certain tendencies, if we're moving in the directions that we imagine we want to go for our lives, for the world, so forth and so on, then there's at least, and I want to be careful about this because I'm ambivalent, but there's at least a potential that when a social experience happens, when an event or a contingency, causes these things to spill out onto the streets, that we will be ready in a certain sense to sort of participate and to that our conditioning will help us to respond in the moment, because we're going to respond. Contingency, we're in contingency always already. We're responding no matter what, and our bodies are sort of doing that regardless of how we come into the situation. So there are some improvisation scholars that would suggest that what musical improvising can do is to get us ready for that moment so that we can respond in a way that aligns with our values. And I think I'm mostly on board with that, I guess. I don't know if that addresses everything in your question, but those are my two most immediate thoughts.
No, that's great. And then I have a synthesizing thought, pulling together, I think, the Ahmed quote and how you were talking, well, the Dolphy chapter, the Ahmed quote, and then this way we're talking through Black Lives Matter right now. And something I really appreciate about the Dolphy chapter is there's this part, I think it's more towards the end, where you give us an interpersonal example or autoethnographic example early on about what it means to make music and collaborate with other people to try to push on this idea within music studies or improv studies in particular of the collaboration of the moment. But in Dolphy chapter, you say something along the lines of, it's not just that he was so attuned to his collaborations in each moment, and those change each moment, and then the meaning changes in each moment that we listen to it based on the context that we're listening from, but that for him, really, collaboration was a way of life, and it's how he was organizing his life in general. So maybe to keep going back to this Black Lives Matter point, we can talk more about the interplay between the singular collaboration of the moment of musical improvisation, and then attuning ourselves towards collaboration in general as also part of this readiness that might then open up a particular massive response like Black Lives Matter per the Ahmed quote.
Yeah. The thing about the reason the sort of 2020 moment comes back up in the end of the book is because I'm trying to guard against the reading improvisation as a method. Like, what I really don't want is to sort of characterize improvising musically or socially as something that you can like learn, and therefore that it'll help you become more comfortable with ambiguity and community building and collaboration, and that then we can implement that in a political context and get the world that we want. To me, that is like half right. And it's sort of the more traditional way I would suggest that the scholarship has thought about this is like, it's metaphorical, right? When you play with musicians, you're collaborating. And if we learn from that, then we can implement that in our political sphere and also collaborate, even though everything about translating that from one to the next radically shifts, what's going on. If we really insist that improvisation is singular, if we really insist that it's composed from the absolute singularity of the time, place, circumstance, subjects, objects, environments, then in the process of translating musical to social, you've wrecked the whole thing already. So I don't think that you can implement it as a method. And in the last part of the book, when I'm sort of like zooming out and talking about our current moment, I'm thinking with Rancière, because I love that Rancière also says something like that. He's like, you can't just go ahead and do what I'm talking about. You can't just go ahead and do equality. Like you're trying to imagine a better world while you're stuck using the terms of our current world. So you're not going to be able to like force the question. And I think the 2020 protest moment like shows us that, right? That is not something that was planned. That was not something that was implemented. That was not something that was learned necessarily. If we're thinking about what it happened and what it was trying to accomplish. However, it's also not possible. It wouldn't have been possible, that moment, without the cultivation of tendencies and habits and ways of being and ways of relating to other people. So that's where, the improvisation of everyday life as actually habitual, routine, repetitive, stuff that looks normal and boring, that's when it comes to matter, is because when the event strikes, how we've been relating to one another matters deeply all of a sudden in a moment that couldn't have been anticipated. So it's those kinds of tendencies that I think where the political potential of improvising lies. And to me, that doesn't have a whole lot to do with improvisation as it's traditionally understood. It has to do with boring stuff. It has to do with, as you're saying, like rehearsing with your friends. It has to do with taking care of one another. Yeah, it's not creative and unpredictable the way that improvisation is often made out to be. It's repetitive because what you're repeating is the thing that you care about. Actually, you have to insist on taking care of other people every single day, even if that doesn't look very exciting.
Yeah, no, gosh, there's so much to think about, and I've already thought with you so much about this work, but it makes me go back to just the importance of not just Ahmed, but Ahmed's queer phenomenology to the text, right? So queer phenomenology is a turning away from normative lines, and sometimes you don't, just summarizing for people who maybe don't know the text. And so you're turning away without necessarily knowing what you're turning towards, and it's active and it's ongoing and therefore can't be boiled down to a method, but it also includes things like refusing to sit at the family table in a normative way and all these things. So just thinking about, Ahmed, and maybe we can just transition into chapter 4 to give people more of a case study grounding from here too. But the practice of consistently turning away without knowing what the desired line might be or not being able to see it clearly, but then being ready for a moment when you notice a shift through this attunement of care, which I think you write about really beautifully as feminist affects. So maybe we can go there and talk about that album a bit too.
Yeah, sure. For folks who don't know, this album, I think I have a slide that I can throw up real quick. It's a Ingrid Laubrock and Kris Davis album. It's a duo record called Blood Moon. Yeah, there it is. Boop, looks like that. And I love this record for a couple of reasons. I think there are like 10 compositions on it, 10 tracks on it, 8 compositions. 2 of the tracks are improvised, but only 2. And these are 2 creative musicians sort of at the top of their game, most known for their improvising. They play experimental improvised music. You could call it jazz across a variety of different bands and contexts. So in a way, it's surprising that there are only 2 improvised tracks on this record. But what I talk about both of them in the chapter, and what I love about this record so much is that there are only two musicians, and the improvising when it does happen, and also because they stand out so starkly against the composed tracks, you can hear so directly how they react to one another in the improvised moment, how they support each other, how they respond to each other. And I do ultimately talk about this, after having read your work, Christine, as an instance of feminist affect, because it feels really feminist to me, even though I don't know why. Like, I'm listening to it, there's no lyrical content, there's no sort of objectively identifiable criteria that I can point to and say, this is feminist music because see right there, that's what it is. And yet it's sort of becoming palpable in my listening experience. And so I think about it in terms of anyway, and it's also super clear, like I said, because there are two of them and it's a duo. So you can hear the way that they support each other in a musical dialogue, although dialogue is a bit problematic, because whatever is needed in the moment, no matter what it is in terms of content, is offered by the other person. So if somebody's way up high in the stratosphere, the other musician is down below balancing that out somehow. If somebody's like doing virtuosic runs, then the other musician is supporting with like sustained pads and chords, or sometimes they're doing something together, right, before they spin out and land in different places. And there's all different ways. It's difficult to define what support means in this context because there's so many different ways of showing it. But what became clear in listening and then in talking to Ingrid Laubrock about this is that they have this very deep musical and personal relationship, interpersonal relationship. They're good friends. They work together across the industry to support one another, to show up to each other's gigs, to play in each other's bands, to create the kind of musical infrastructure that is hard to sustain, particularly in experimental music, particularly in a place like New York. And I'm suggesting in the chapter that you can perceive that in the music, in the way that they listen super closely to one another and respond, which is so much more immediately palpable because they are working in duo and there's less mediation, there's less musical interference or noise. It's super, super direct. So yeah, feminist affect is ultimately how that ends up being talked about in that chapter.
I was thinking, do we want to on the fly play a minute and maybe just do a close listening to really bring people into this dynamic you're talking about?
That's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
If you give me a second, I can
No problem.
find it, I think.
I can talk as you're looking for it too. I can talk away, but something I also really appreciate about this chapter is going to Pauline Oliveros and her concept of deep listening, and then which I know about through Amber Messer writing about deep listening, but then not engaging with that text. And right, there are lots of reasons why we can't engage with every text about the same thing, but this idea, once again, of attunement and coming to know one another through listening, which is also deeply effective and vibrational practice. So what I really appreciate about this chapter is that attention in a new kind of upfront way about, and maybe because this is what my work is about too, but the sonic, the affective, and the vibrational together. So I'll just turn it back to you.
Yeah, deep listening is super important here. I'll just say one more thing before we play a little bit. Some scholars have written about Oliveros' work as evincing what a lesbian musicality, right? Which is which moves away from power over relationships and foregrounds reciprocality. And I don't necessarily think that feminist affect and lesbian musicality are the same thing, though they're distinct concepts, but I think they're both useful for thinking about how important listening and reciprocality are to feminist musical practice, right? I'm sort of suggesting that, like, in an embodied way, the way these two musicians respond to each other very directly sounds different than a lot of masculinized improvising. And I'm suggesting that, yeah, like, gender is an important factor here. It's not reducible to gender, but it is a factor in how this improvisation takes place, and it's equally significant in as any musical technique or vocabulary. And in particular, the musical vocabulary in this case is super idiosyncratic and is influenced by the fact that the two of them have played together for like more than 20 years. So it's this very, very singular sort of vocabulary, which is worth listening to for sure. So I'll play maybe, I don't know, maybe the first 2 minutes of this track. Gun Weep is the first improvised track, and Elephant in the Room is the second one. So hopefully this comes through okay. That's a good place to stop in, maybe. I don't want to spoil it by saying anything, but also the note that Kris Davis enters on, right? I think it's an E. I can't remember. I don't have perfect pitch. But it takes a while for Kris Davis, for the piano to enter. And when it does, it's built around this one sort of droning note that gets repeated. And that sort of motivic development lasts for a full minute, and Laubrock then also picks it up, right, and starts double tonguing on that same note. The point is, they're building something together. They're working it through and exploring it, and they don't leave it until it's done. So there's this kind of co-creation that feels like, yeah, like I said, I think very immediately sort of audible because there's only two people and you can hear what they're doing. And it's not just about this virtuosic performance of like, look how I play the saxophone, which in my humble opinion, you do encounter in a lot of improvised music, perhaps particularly improvised music performed by men.
Yeah, I haven't listened to it in a while, so I think I'm just sitting with the do we want to pivot out to
we can go
how this concept is feels so rich that it's pushing you towards this next project. Maybe go a little bit in that direction too. This idea of feminist affect, which is now in the title of the next book project. Maybe we can go there for a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll talk about that for 30 seconds. And then we can maybe open it up to folks. Because I am really excited to talk about it, but I also, I'll save the bulk of it hopefully for another session sometime in the future. But yeah, this idea of feminist affect was very influential for me after having worked on this project. It really only appears in that one chapter, in chapter 4, but is something that almost immediately started to allow me to think about other music in the background, like while I was finishing the book. And now that's where I'm turning my attention full time, which is like thinking about contemporary indie rock made by women and queer musicians. So non-cis men in the indie rock space, right, are having a bit of a moment, however you might characterize that moment. I'm thinking of bands like Soccer Mommy, Indigo D'Souza, the Ophelias, Vagabond, JSOM, and yeah, looking for language to talk about their musical and political contributions, even though, again, and kind of similarly to Laubrock, honestly, when they're asked about feminist politics, when they're asked about queer politics, they have a tendency to defer, push back, or resist in some ways to talking directly about those things, which is not to say that those issues aren't important to them, but they sort of bristle at the way that the press tends to approach those questions. So you can't go easily hunting for, aha, this is what you think about feminist politics, and this is how it appears in your music. They're sort of creating an opacity about it, right? So feminist affect is this, again, this way of trying to account for, like, why do I know in my bones that this is feminist music, and why, like, how do I talk about why that's such a powerful and compelling part of why I gravitate towards it, why I'm oriented towards it, and why listeners who might share my political and social affiliations are also orienting towards that call in the absence of overt statements about, hey, this is music for you, you belong over here. So I'm thinking about feminist affect in the indie rock space for the second book, and I hope maybe in next year I can come back and talk about that a little more, or we can talk about it in Q&A or whatever. And thanks, Christine, for doing this. I really appreciate your questions.
I appreciate you. Can I say one more thing before we go to
Q&A?
Because it made me think of one more thing I wanted to say about the book, just this way you're talking about feminist affect in this project and what it might do in the next one, and back to the opening about why hasn't, like, how to define improvisation without making it a method or a map to follow. Oh no, I'm about to lose the thought. I just had it. I was going to say, as someone who comes from performance studies and not music theory, like, I know improvisation through reading a lot of Fred Moten, and the performance studies focus is on doing with this sometimes slippage into an assumption of meaning. So I think the critical theory work in this book of trying to define something that's relational and singular, but you're trying to catch some kind of pattern of, is the work of critical theory. And I think you really got it here, because it's hard to do. So I just wanted to make sure I said that before we get to Q&A.
I appreciate it. I will restrain myself from responding for the moment.
Well, this is a terrific conversation, Dan and Christine, and we can open things up to Q&A. I'll just say, knowing that you were saying Kris Davis versus Kristeva, it was very enlightening in my thinking. But at any rate, okay. So the first question was from Gus. Gus, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks so much for the conversation, and I'm really excited to read the book. I'm really looking forward to it. And my question is just about the kind of intellectual genealogy of improvisation and critiques of improvisation, and sort of thinking about the Birmingham School and the kind of the centrality of like bricolage. And, you know, that's obviously a tradition that's much in a lot more proximity to Marxism than a lot of what you were putting up as examples earlier in the talk. And I wondered if you think that that's vulnerable to the same critique, or is there something that's more materialist or more, you know, more critical of the commodity or something like that in that work? I was also interested to hear your thoughts similarly about Certeau and that, who also seems to me like, maybe this is a partly generational thing, but had such a huge influence on like people of my generation in the 90s in grad school. So yeah.
Yeah. I'm so where to begin? Certeau is like a really important figure for me in the back half of the book, in particular because he uses explicitly the language of improvisation, and does so in the context of what I would suggest are most commonly understood to be anti-improvisatory moments. So in a lot of improvisation scholarship, you know, improvisation is amazing because it opens up the new, the unexpected. It conditions us to get comfortable with ambiguity, uncertainty, indeterminacy. And therefore, it stands as a kind of opposite to the stuff you do in your life, like when you're doing the dishes or vacuuming or going to work. And yet, Certeau is saying, when you're walking and when you're reading, these are the improvisatory moments. So what's up with that? That's sort of like the introduction to the second half of the book. It takes his idea of walking as a metonym for all everyday activities and asks the question, like, what for Certeau is improvisatory about walking? And I think we already get a sense of how singularity factors into his argument. You know, it's improvisatory because everybody has a singular gait, everybody makes their own routes, so forth and so on. And so I guess what I suggest in the book is like, if contingency is a concept that's supposed to be both about open indeterminacies and very closed singular specificities, that when you look at something like walking, those two categories collapse on each other. The closer you look at any openings, the more particularities and specificities you find. And the closer you look at all these specificities, the more openings and indeterminacies you find. So I don't know if that exactly gets at your question, but I take Certeau's like walking on a path, and I try to read it like a musical score. And I suggest that, you know, the path is the score that you've got written. And if you deviate from the path and jump over the wall, then you're improvising, right? And I try to complicate that a little bit and suggest that you're improvising anyway. It's already happening. If you're walking straight along that sidewalk, you're improvising because you're enmeshed in singularity. You know, me walking down that sidewalk is much different from Christine walking down that sidewalk, depending on the context, right? And also, forget about the sidewalk. What city are you in? What neighborhood are you in? How do those extra musical parameters affect the improvisation that you're engaged in as it is? Certeau is where I start. He's not where I end, but I find him very, very generative in that sense. And I didn't even address your question about bricolage at all. So sorry about that.
Okay, the next two comments are both, one is from Joe and one is from Barry, but both are kind of asking questions or making comments about agency and freedom and how your work is also kind of moving away from that. So I don't know if both of you want to comment on each other or take it from there, Joe and Barry.
I mean, just the whole question of who gets to improvise. I mean, in a great deal of music, just taking in narrowly the musical context here for the moment, that and I think the analogy should be clear, that you end up with I mean, one of my favorite examples would be North Indian music, where you usually have the master performer who has almost unlimited license to improvise as long as they're more or less staying within the genre. And I've even heard people go and grab phrases from Western music that were totally outside the genre. And everybody else has a great deal of what's in some senses improvisation to keep in there and play the way they seem to be effectively directed by the master's improvisation, but they have a very limited ability to improvise in any direction that isn't what the master more or less dictated. Because I just feel like sometimes the improvisation, because of its association with certain things from jazz in particular, tends to suggest a certain egalitarianism that isn't necessarily, that they're really two separate issues, whether you've got that at all egalitarian relationship and whether you have an improvisatory situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I'll just respond to that real quickly. I think your example from ragas is equally applicable to jazz. I mean, if you think about jazz, like it's not at all egalitarian, right? Everybody gets a turn. That's an important thing. But at a given moment, there's a soloist and there are accompanists and there are roles, I suppose, that are conditioned by genre. Genre is one of the parameters that's affecting the singular contextual contingent situation. And I think you're totally right to point out that those roles really shift depending on the context that you're in, the genre space that you're in, and that it's complicated and potentially problematic to sort of just extrapolate from a very specific musical traditional sort of genre space and make political and social claims based on that creative interaction.
Barry, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Christine. And thanks to the organizers of this wonderful series for allowing you guys an opportunity to participate in it. Dan, I have 127,000 questions, and most of them you've heard before. So here's a slightly different version of one of them. So it's partially a response to Gus's question about how does the emphasis on improvisation respond to previous scholarship, and not necessarily just the Birmingham School, but other kinds of things as well. And I see your emphasis, that the historical emphasis on improvisation as it being a way to extract agency from a previous, emphasis, the Althusserian emphasis on determination and structure and those kinds of things. Okay. And in that way, it sort of fits more with Gramsci's hegemony understanding as a continual struggle. But the analysis then, what I like about what you do is you eschew agency determination. You don't even bother with that. You just move on, and then responding to contingency is like a continual, ongoing process. And then the analysis, as you do, must turn to the conditions under which a moment of contingency is encountered and responded to, which then could lead to an endless recursive journey of the conditions that led to the conditions that led to the conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so here's the question I know I've asked you before, but I'm interested in how you're thinking about it now, is like, how do you set the limit to that frame? How do you frame when you've considered enough conditions, right? How, in the analysis. And then I have another version of this question. I'm sorry to do this, which is a response to Joe's question, which I think is really important, which is how do you integrate power into your analysis of contingency?
Just writing. I think that the second part is easier to answer potentially, because power ends up being really important, especially in the everyday life section of the book. But yeah, but also in the musical section. I mean, I talk a little bit about like free improvisation as this special context for a lot of scholars, because unlike jazz or any number of genres, free improvisation ostensibly has the potential for that type of actual egalitarianism, right? At least musically speaking. And then what I talk about there is like, yeah, I accept, for these conversations that I have with let's say, for example, women, right, who freely improvise with men and often feel like walked all over. And it's not about the genre or the musical technique at that moment. It has to do with identity. So power factors in to even musical spaces that are geared towards intentionally sort of lowering the thresholds and the barriers and the hierarchies. And that's why I'm always on my, soapbox about like, we have to stop thinking just about the music and we have to think about the broader things. In the section on everyday life, that's kind of the impulse that I take to thinking about power is like, if you start at the musical interaction, again, walking down the street, you can zoom out and you can talk about, Desartaux was talking about the gate and the path, how you walk through the city. But again, that city has been sort of redlined into specific neighborhoods. That's about power. How you're, if you're pregnant or you're disabled, how you're navigating those spaces, that's about power. If you're trying to take public transportation versus if you have a car, if you have that enhanced capacity to improvise with an autonomous vehicle, that's about power. And then at the biggest level, and I think hopefully what I'm trying to do is get to the first part of your question. At the biggest level, there's, thinking about Christina Sharp's work, talking about the weather of anti-Blackness as an environment, as something that's equally factoring into the contextual scene that you're trying to navigate. That's just as real as the pavement on which you're walking, and that's about power. So I'm not saying that they're all the same, that like physical concrete parameters are the same thing as a discursive environment of anti-Blackness, but they each do affect what you're capable and incapable of doing based on how you come into a situation, based on your capacities, your cultivated tendencies, your habits, what musical vocabulary you're able to bring to bear on a situation. All those things are refracting and filtering your agency in that moment to the point where as you were saying, like structure and agency sort of collapse in on one another and become co-constitutive at that moment. So where do you draw the line in terms of how do I decide to limit or cut off the analysis? Yeah, that's going to be contingent and arbitrary and subject to page limits and word counts and my own capabilities. But I don't know. What I try to do in the book, I guess, is model a method of, here's what I have a good reason to suspect matters in this equation and not that one. And that's why Dolphy's is about following Francesca is about eccentricity, right? And not about and not in Mr. K is not about that at all. And for Mr. K, it's about pedagogy and white anxieties in Norway. And so I think you have to reinvent the question every single time you're looking in every case, and then just hope that you considered the things that matter here, not in an exhaustive way, but because you've selected them because they don't factor into the next case so much, but you can really see them popping over here. You know what I mean?
That's cool. Carl, do you want to make your comment about deep listening and utopia?
Yeah, I'm gonna avoid turning my camera on just to minimize the possibility that I crash the Zoom again. But thanks, Dan and Christine, for this conversation. It's been really interesting. When you were talking about deep listening, it struck me that as the way that people talk about that and the rhetoric and scholarship around that kind of offers an alternative in some ways to that kind of like collective action utopian way of talking about improvisation. Like in my experience, a lot of contemporary improvisers talk about listening all the time. And in some ways I wonder, because I agree with you that I think it had its place, and certainly in terms of like Black Power's relationship to, the ACM and all of that kind of thing. Like there was a reason that rhetoric came up in the first place, but definitely the idea of improvising as an analogous to liberation and to organizing is a sloppy metaphor. But in some ways, the cultivation of listening and the kind of listening that like a lot of free improvisation asks for is a method in a different way. And in some ways, not just for the musician, but for the listener, if you can kind of enter into that space. And it has to do with attention, and it has to do with mindfulness and all of these things. And I wonder if there's maybe a politically optimistic way to talk about that could be more productive. And maybe that's in some ways what you're getting at with the analogies to everyday life that you're making.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I actually talk about listening as an everyday activity in the second part of the book, because it so fruitfully connects to the first part of the book, I think. I totally agree that that's a potentially better and more useful political framework that comes out of studying what musicians are involved in doing. And at the same time, I also for me, listening is in a lot of ways very, very similar to improvising in terms of its potential as a model. So one problem with listening, because Pauline Oliveros does talk about it as a utopian practice, she does talk about it as something that can increase empathy and our capacity to respond to one another. And I follow her on that, but to a limit. And there are two sort of like quick examples that I can just bring up to talk about that. So one is like, I use Marie Thompson's work on the gendered aspects of listening and the emotional labor that women have to perform as the listeners in their relationships, right? That listening to people, whether it's because you're, in the famous example, a flight attendant or a bartender, and it's professionalized, or in interpersonal context with the people you love, it falls to non-men basically to do the listening, right? And so we have to be careful again, like, yes, there is this potential there, but if you actually like look at the singular and contingent instantiations of this practice, often it ends up being inequitable because we are always funneling those practices through the society in which we live. And the other thing that gives me a little bit of pause about Oliveros is, for her, listening is a way of fostering empathy. And I think folks like Zain Yao have talked about the limits of empathy as a sort of white affective response to other people's plights, basically. And that the danger there in reinscribing the centrality of the white gaze in that relationship is if we're learning how to empathize with other people, we're also creating them as distinct from ourselves in that she talks about it as being a colonial relationship. So it's a brief part of the book, but I pretty much read it in parallel with the way I've talked about improvisation here as a potential, but one that manifests in singular and often very problematic ways.
Yeah, for sure. Which kind of brings us back to Barry's question in some ways. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Would you like to take a stab at one more question from Barry on sounding feminism or sounding feminist before we call it a day today?
Well, I'm willing, I've already asked a question. Eric, do you have your Fred Moten question that you want to ask?
I certainly can.
I want to hear it.
I'll ask a quick Fred Moten question, and if it's answered quick, I'll throw in a very short big ears question. But the Fred Moten question is, I was under this is me not knowing much, so I'm going to ask it anyway. I had a sense that improvisation also was used in a kind of appropriative way, not just by neoliberalism, but by non-Black performers looking to sort of recodify jazz as something other than Black communal creativity. Am I right to think that Fred Moten tries to sort of claim improvisation back from that? And I'm wondering where your analyses of improvisation live against what I'm taking to be his, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think you're wrong about that. I do think that's happening. I do think for Moten, improvisation in Moten is really fascinating, and like I don't think I still have my head around it.
Fair enough.
Because like, but what my understanding of it is like he's looking at improvisation in the context of Black avant-garde performances and developing something robust out of that, and is not so much concerned with, like, for example, the type of improvising that I'm talking about when you're like driving Uber or whatever. You know what I mean? It's a very specific formulation that I think has been really influential. And I think some of the scholars that I'm trying to sort of push back against look at Moten and look at the musicians he's talking about and extrapolate from that relationships of freedom and egalitarianism. And that is why I was so sort of like delighted to read when in Black and Blur, when he says, jazz doesn't disappear the problem, jazz is the problem. And it will not disappear, right?
Okay. So you think Fred Moten's beating improvisation to death as well? On some level. At least when it's jazz. Okay.
On some level, I suppose. I mean, I just love that quote because like what he's saying is like, you don't have jazz without the oppression that births it, right? So for other scholars to look at jazz and see a way out of the oppression that is informing jazz itself is to get the thing backwards, I think.
Okay. Really quick. So it's conceivable, that in 10 days, when I go to the Big Ears Festival in Knoxville, Tennessee, Fred Moten might be there. And it's a walking space. You spend 3 days walking around in an improvisational landscape. Changes the nature of how one encounters this music. Is that a pure space of privilege, or can we actually learn something from what I find to be a fairly delightful 3-day thing that has forever changed my relationship to a whole set of musicians that I'd pretty much written off as I'm just not able to slow down enough for these people?
Having never been, I can only evade by saying it's got to be both. Yeah.
I guess the proper way to put that question is, can we cultivate spaces for actually existing improvisational artists and work without always worrying about Uber drivers and
Yeah.
contingent faculty members. just to keep it close to the bone.
That's a great question. And I think so. I mean, I say this all the time. I say this every time I talk about the book, but in spite of the big game I talk in the front, I want to have it both ways, right? The reason that I spend so much time talking about Dolphy is because it's amazing, and because I think you can learn things from it. And this is where, like, at the end, I'm most sympathetic to Tracy McMullen's formula of it, because she's like, she looks at music and doesn't see a method per se, but she does suggest, like, when we engage in this way, it's really different from most of the stuff we do. And so isn't that worth paying attention to? And I cannot disagree with that. I really can't. I try to thread the needle in a slightly different way, but yeah. I think that's right. I think there is something special about what you do in a situation like that when you're aware of it and when you're sort of actively focused on orienting in the direction of pursuing ambiguity in community with people you care about, which isn't to say that power doesn't operate on that, because of course it does. But that's the whole point, is you're doing it in spite of the power operating on you. You're like, yeah, I know, but I'm trying to see around the corner, at, you know, something that I will never be able to predict, but and that's where I'm going anyway.
Thank you.
That's
Can I
terrific.
weave in really quick? I just want to say,
Oh, yeah.
you cheated, Dan. You said in a community of people that you care about. And that closes the circle, right? That limits the politics of who you're engaging with and what it's doing. And don't do that. Okay, I'll shut up.
Okay. Well, on that note, let us just say thank you so much to Dan and Christine for this terrific conversation, and to all of you for coming tonight and or today, depending on where you are. And I wanted to also just mention that on April 3rd, our next presenter will be Christine Capetola and Lauren McLeod Kramer. Christine will be talking on sonic feminists. Lauren will be sharing a work in progress, a black joint, and it's going to be terrific. It's going to be all the way live. And is there any other business that we need to do? Okay.
I just want to add, because if we haven't let people know, we're also adding an event to the calendar the week after that on April 10th with Maria. I'm not going to be able to pronounce her name properly because it's not in front of me. Maria Sonovetsky, who's got a book about 1980s Ukrainian punk coming out in the 33 and a Third Europe series, and we've added that to the calendar for obvious present reasons. So we'll get announcements about that out when we can too.